Active voice. Passive voice. What is voice in a linguistic context, and how does English compare to German? Well, this is one of the rare cases where the English and German languages are roughly even in terms of complexity. Usually German is grammatically and syntactically more complex than English, but in this case, both languages are kind of complex, but they're complex in different ways, and it ends up, on balance, being about even in terms of complexity and difficulty. Both languages have an active and a passive voice in which you can write or speak, but the way these voices are handled are slightly different across the two languages, and there's some important distinctions that you need to know about. So let's talk about active and passive voice in English and German and see how the two languages contrast and compare. From the beautiful mountain town of Canmore, Alberta, this is Lernen und Fahren. Go 3, 2, 1. So what is active voice and passive voice? What does that mean? Well, it refers to the relationship between the subject of a sentence and the verb in that sentence. If the subject is the person, place, or thing that is doing the action represented by the verb in that sentence, then we are speaking or writing in the active voice. Most of the time, you are going to be speaking or writing in active voice without even realizing it because it's by far the more commonly used voice. So for example, Heinrich throws the ball, Kristen buys the bread, Carl sleeps. Those are all active voice sentences because the subject of the sentence is doing the action in the sentence. Great. If the subject, however, is on the receiving end of the action represented by the verb in the sentence, then you are writing or speaking in the passive voice. For example, the ball is thrown by Heinrich. The bread is bought by Kristen. What we've done there is taken the object of the former active voice sentence and promoted it to position 1 in the sentence, and it becomes the subject of the passive voice sentence. And we take the former subject of the active voice sentence and throw it to the object part of the passive voice sentence, where it in fact becomes optional. It's perfectly valid to say the ball is thrown or the bread is bought without saying who's doing this action. Now, a little terminology to get out of the way. If the person, place, or thing that's doing the action is mentioned in the sentence, they are referred to as the agent. So, the ball is thrown by Heinrich. Heinrich is the agent of that sentence because he's doing the throwing. The bread is bought by Kristen. Kristen is the agent. Now, if the agent is present in a passive voice sentence, in English, he, she, or it is always introduced with the word by. The ball is thrown by Heinrich. The bread is bought by Kristen. Keep that in the back of your head because we will revisit that when we talk about German. Okay, so great. We've got a construct in the language that allows us to transpose the subject and the object of the sentence without changing the meaning. Fine. Why would we want to use that? Why does this exist? I can think of 5 reasons why we might want to use passive voice in English. Number 1, maybe the agent of the sentence is unknown. For example, 4 people were notified. Well, okay, notified by whom? Well, we don't know. Maybe they were notified anonymously. If the agent is unknown, that's one reason why you might switch to passive voice, because the agent becomes optional in a passive voice sentence, and if you don't know who it is, you can just omit it from the sentence. Great. A second reason is perhaps you want to de-emphasize the agent in order to emphasize the action, the thing that's happening, or the subject, the recipient of the action. So for example, 5 people were awarded the Nobel Prize. Okay, awarded by whom? Well, the Nobel Prize Committee, presumably, but it's not important. That's not what the story's about. What we want to emphasize there is the award itself. Or if we want to emphasize the subject of the passive voice sentence, for example, the building was completely destroyed by fire. If we're talking about a building, yes, we explicitly mentioned the agent in that sentence, by fire. We could rephrase that in active voice. We could say fire completely destroyed the building, but if the conversation is about the building, maybe we want to stress that in the sentence. We put it in position 1 in order to do so. The building was completely destroyed by fire. A third reason you might use passive voice is to emphasize objectivity or to create the appearance of objectivity. So, for example, you'll see this in scientific reports and studies. You might see a sentence like, 50 patients were carefully examined. Okay, that sounds more clinical and more objective than saying, we examined 50 patients. And it sounds better even than I examined 50 patients. If you are conducting a solo study, But you don't want people to know that it's a solo study. You want people to think that you've got a whole team of people behind you. You can say 50 patients were examined instead of saying I examined 50 patients, and it gives the illusion that you have a team working behind you. It creates a certain impression in the minds of the readers of your study. Now, this is where we have to be careful because passive voice in English can get a little bit slimy. It can get a little bit shady. A fourth reason why you might use passive voice is to avoid taking responsibility for something. So for example, if a corporation dumps 500 tons of toxic chemical waste into the city's municipal water supply, you might get a really slimy corporate PR person getting in front of the cameras at a press conference and saying something like, "Mistakes were made." Mistakes were made? What does that mean? Who made those mistakes? Well, gee, I don't know. Could have been anybody. Could have been us. Could have been somebody else. What they're trying to avoid saying there is, we made mistakes. Active voice. They don't want to say that because it creates a certain impression in the minds of the people listening to them. What they want to do is try to avoid claiming responsibility, and so they'll switch to passive voice in order to avoid mentioning the agent there, which is themselves. Another slimy use of passive voice in English, you'll see this in certain unethical journalistic pieces or pseudo-journalistic pieces. If you're reading a news article about a crime that took place, you might see a sentence like, "The suspect was heard to confess to the crime." The suspect was heard to confess to the crime. Okay, heard by whom? What is the source of this information? I don't know because the article's not telling me. You can use passive voice to avoid citing your sources, which is not what you want to do as a journalist, as a proper journalist. Now, I know you can be slimy in the active voice as well. You can write something like, "A rock shattered the store window." Technically, that's an active voice sentence, but you're not telling me who threw that rock, and surely that's the most important part of that story, right? So slimy journalists are going to be slimy in whatever voice they're using. So, I mean, it is what it is, but if you see passive voice being used heavily in a news article, it's maybe not a red flag, but it's certainly at least a yellow flag. There might be something shady going on there. So, if I can end my little mini-rant on passive voice, if you are writing or speaking on a subject, particularly if it's a technical subject, try to avoid the use of passive voice if you can. If there's a way to rephrase what you're trying to say in active voice, do that, because it almost always sounds better, or at least less shady, less potentially shady than the use of passive voice. Okay, end of rant. I don't like passive voice because it can be used for shady purposes, but it is what it is. Let's keep going. Now, in English, the pure passive voice can only be used with transitive verbs. What's a transitive verb? Well, a verb that transfers its meaning directly from the verb to some direct object. Most verbs in English are either fully transitive or at least are used transitively. So most of the time, you're using a transitive verb. So for example, I see something, I hear something, I throw something, I catch something, I know something, I understand something. The something that comes after that verb is the direct transitive object of that verb. It directly accepts the meaning of that verb. Great. And all of those sentences can be expressed in passive voice. Something is known by me, something is heard by me, something is caught by me, etc., etc., etc. But if you use an intransitive verb, there aren't very many pure intransitive verbs in English. There's a handful. For example, to sleep. Sleep does not take a direct object. You don't sleep something, you just sleep. So, for example, the sentence, Carl sleeps or Carl is sleeping, you cannot express that in English in the passive voice. Why? Because there's no direct object there to promote to position one of the sentence. There's no direct object that comes after the verb to sleep. Now you might think, well, okay, what if I say Carl sleeps on the bed? Isn't that an object for the verb sleep? Well, no, not really. The word on is a directional preposition that introduces the indirect object of the verb to sleep. You don't sleep something on a bed, you just sleep on a bed. Nothing comes after the word sleep. Oh, well, what if I say Carl sleeps well? Isn't that putting something after the verb sleep? Well, sure, you're putting an adverb after the verb sleep. You're telling me how Carl is sleeping. But you don't sleep something well, you just sleep well. Nothing comes after sleep. Therefore, there's no object to become the subject of the passive voice sentence. So there's some things in English that cannot be expressed in pure passive voice. But keep that in the back of your head, because we will revisit that also when we talk about German. Now, why do I keep saying pure passive voice? Oop, pedestrians. There, it turns out, is a lingering remnant of a third voice in English, a middle voice. It's neither fully active nor fully passive. Mediopassive. It does not have a distinct verb form in English, but it's still around, presumably from an older version of the English language or from some ancestral language. You can say things like, "This motorcycle drives really smoothly." Well, okay, the motorcycle doesn't drive, it's being driven. I'm driving it. It sounds like I'm trying to construct that in the passive voice, but I phrase that in an active way. The motorcycle drives really smoothly. This is a valid sentence in English. It's mediopassive. It's neither fully active nor fully passive. You can say something like, "This report reads like a nightmare." Well, okay, the report doesn't read anything. It's an inanimate object. But it's a valid way to phrase that in English to say, "This report reads like a nightmare." It's neither fully active nor fully passive. Now, the interesting thing about mediopassive in English is that you can use verbs intransitively with it. It is believed to be 500 years old. It is thought to be the last of its kind. You can use verbs intransitively, so it sort of breaks the rule that I said, where the pure passive voice, not talking about mediopassive, can only be used in English with transitive verbs. Mediopassive kind of breaks that rule. But mediopassive is a bit wonky. I don't have much to say about it, so let's move on. Okay, I think that covers us for English. Let's talk about German. German, at first glance, is very similar to English. In fact, in the active voice, it's almost identical to English. Heinrich wirft den Ball, Christian kauft das Brot, Karl schläft. Direct translations of our English active voice sentences. No surprises. I don't have much to say about active voice in German, other than to point out that, just like in English, it is far more common to use active voice than passive voice. Most of the time, you are going to be speaking or writing in active voice without even thinking about it, because that's the most commonly used voice. But let's look at passive voice. It's slightly different than the English passive voice. The first difference that we'll notice, remember in English we said that if the agent is present in a passive voice sentence, he, she, or it in English is always introduced with the word by. Not so in German. In German, we have three different options depending on context. If the agent is a living being, like a person, then you use von. So, der Ball wurde von Heinrich geworfen. Das Brot wurde von Christian gekauft. Von literally means of or from, but we have to be very careful here not to try to do a literal translation. Let's see what happens if we try to do a literal translation. Das Brot wurde von Christian gekauft. I might try to translate that as the bread was bought from Christian, but that's not at all what I'm saying. That makes it sound as though that Christian is the one selling the bread. But that's not what we're saying. We're saying Christian is the one buying the bread. So in passive voice, we have to translate von in German into by in English. The bread was bought by Christian. And von, you might remember from previous videos, is a dative preposition. So you have to be careful when forming the passive voice to make sure that you use the right case. So if you want to say the ball was thrown by a child, you would say der Ball wurde von einem Kind geworfen. Einem Kind, because von requires a dative object. Now if the agent... found neutral. Now, if the agent is an inanimate object, you don't use von, but rather durch. Durch literally means through, but again, don't try to translate it literally. If you say das Gebäude wurde durch Feuer zerstört, the building was destroyed literally through fire, but we wouldn't say it that way in English. You have to translate durch in the passive voice to by. The building was destroyed by fire. And durch is an accusative preposition, so again, be careful when you're forming passive voice sentences, because the case can change on you depending on what you're talking about. Now there's a third option in German. If the agent is a dative object, you don't use von or durch, but rather mit. Mit literally means with, but again, don't try to translate it literally. Mit in the passive voice has to also be translated into English as by. So, die Frau wurde mit einem Auto abgeholt. The woman was picked up literally with a car, but in English you'd say the woman was picked up by a car. Now I want to take a brief sidetrack here. It's going to sound like it's a non sequitur. It's going to sound like it's not relevant, because this is not specific to active or passive voice, but I promise you this will be relevant, directly relevant, in a minute. So let's talk about the difference between describing things using some conjugation of werden versus describing things using some conjugation of Sein. This applies throughout the entire German language. You use some conjugation of sein if you're describing a specific attribute or quality or state of an object. You use werden if you're describing an action or a process or an event. So for example, das Haus war schön. The house was pretty. Das Haus wurde zerstört. The house was destroyed. Both war und würde in those sentences translate to English as was, but they mean different things. Das Haus wurde zerstört is talking about an event, something that happened, something that took place. So we use a conjugation of werden instead of sein. Whereas when we're saying the house is pretty, we're just describing an attribute of the house, so we just use some conjugation of sein or ist or war. Das Haus war schön. Now again, that applies throughout the entire German language, so why bring it up randomly in the middle of a discussion of passive voice? Well, let's talk about passive voice. The Germans subdivide their passive voice into what they call Vorgangspassiv und Zustandspassiv. Vorgangspassiv means process passive, and Zustandspassiv means status passive, and you might guess where I'm going with this. Vorgangspassiv is about talking about events or processes or actions, things that happened, whereas Zustandspassiv is about talking about the end result of some action or process. You're describing quality or state of something, so Vorgangspassiv will always use some conjugation of werden, und Zustandspassiv will always use some conjugation of sein. So let's look at Vorgangspassiv. The car is being sold by the woman, passive voice. Das Auto wird von der Frau verkauft. The car was being sold by the woman. Das Auto wurde von der Frau verkauft. The car has been sold by the woman, present perfect tense. Das Auto ist von der Frau verkauft worden. The car had been sold by the woman, past perfect tense. Das Auto war von der Frau verkauft worden. The car will be sold by the woman. Future tense. Das Auto wird von der Frau verkauft werden. Notice how every one of those examples uses werden, and notice how werden changes conjugation to show tense, to show when in time something is happening. The exception to this is if you're using a modal verb to modify the main verb. Remember from previous videos, if you use a modal verb to modify the main verb gets reconjugated back to the full infinitive and gets pushed to the end of the sentence clause. So the car has to be sold. Das Auto muss verkauft werden. The car had to be sold, past tense. Das Auto musste verkauft werden. Notice that werden stays in the infinitive in both of those examples, and it's müssen that conjugates to show when in time something is happening. Okay, that's Vorgangspassiv. Let's talk about Zustandspassiv, and specifically, how do you know when to use which one? Sometimes the distinction between these two is, am I going in circles here? I think I'm going in circles here. Sometimes the distinction between these two is kind of subtle, to the point where it's not clear which one you should use. Let's look at some examples. So for example, das Geschäft war geschlossen. Das Geschäft wurde geschlossen. Both of those translate to English as the store was closed, but they mean slightly different things. Das Geschäft wurde geschlossen is Vorgangspassiv. We're talking about an action or an event or a process, the actual closing of the store. Somebody actually turned off all the lights and swept the floors and locked the doors, etc., etc. That's what we're talking about. In English, you might say the store was being closed. The store was in the process of being closed. We're talking about the actual store closure. Whereas if you use Zustandspassiv, the store was closed. Das Geschäft war geschlossen. What we mean there is, like in English, you might say, by the time we got there, the store was already closed. The store was in the state of having been closed already. It was closed for some time by the time we got there. That's subtle, but the Germans distinguish between these two by switching between Vorgangspassiv and some conjugation of werden, or using Zustandspassiv and some conjugation of sein. Another example, der Mann war schwer verletzt, der Mann wurde schwer verletzt. Both of those translate to English as the man was badly injured, but again, they mean different things. Vorgangspassiv, der Mann wurde schwer verletzt, we're talking about the actual accident or event, something that happened to this guy that made him get injured. Whereas Zustandspassiv, we're talking about the end result of that accident, that injury. So, for example, in English, you might say, like 4 days after the accident happened, the man was still badly injured. Those injuries are still going on. It's a state. The guy's in that state of being injured. As opposed to Vorgangspassiv, which is talking about the actual injury. The man got injured. The man became injured. Now, sometimes the difference between Vorgangspassiv und Zustandspassiv is so subtle that I honestly don't think it makes a difference. For example, ich wurde 1900 geboren. Ich bin 1900 geboren. Those both translate to English as I was born in 1900. I mean, not literally, I'm not that old, but they both translate to English as the same sentence. Is there a difference in German? Technically, one is Vorgangspassiv, I'm talking about the actual birth that happened, and one is Zustandspassiv, I'm talking about the end result, I was born. But does it matter? Does anybody care? I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, please, but I think those two sentences in German are perfectly interchangeable. It does not matter if you pick Vorgangspassiv or Zustandspassiv there. Okay, now, buckle up, because the road is going to get a little bumpy. Let's talk about something called an impersonal passive. Remember when we were talking in English, we said that in English the pure passive voice can only be used with a transitive verb. If the sentence does not have a direct object after the verb, then there's nothing to promote to position one of the sentence. So so there are certain sentences in English that simply cannot be expressed in passive voice. For example, Carl sleeps or Carl is sleeping. Cannot say that in passive voice in English. But guess what? The fact that there's no object to promote to position one and become the subject of the passive voice sentence, that doesn't stop the Germans. They don't care. They will do this quite happily, even with intransitive verbs. It doesn't matter. This results in some sentences that simply don't exist in English and make no sense. You can't even try to translate them to English without fully rewording them. For example, in German, you can say something like, hier wurde geschlafen. What? Something like here was slept, but that's not anything. That's nothing in English. What is that? What we're saying there is someone or something that I'm not describing in this sentence slept here. What we're saying is sleeping of some kind took place here or happened here. That's kind of weird, and we can't express that directly in English. Now, there's a related rule in German where if a sentence doesn't have a subject, you can use what's called a topic placeholder. I don't want to confuse topic with subject because they're not the same thing, as we'll see as we go through these examples. But in German, another way of saying hier wurde geschlafen is you can say es wurde hier geschlafen. Es is the topic placeholder in German. And it sounds like what you're saying there is it slept here, but that's not it. That's not a translation of that sentence. That would be es hat hier geschlafen. What we're saying here is es wurde hier geschlafen is actually directly the same meaning as hier wurde geschlafen. I'm saying someone or something that I'm not describing in this sentence slept here. So what does es translate to in English? Well, it doesn't. Don't try to translate that directly because it simply doesn't work. Hier wurde geschlafen und es wurde hier geschlafen mean the same thing, but interestingly, neither of those options exist in English. Now, I will quickly point out that this rule about using es as a topic placeholder, that is not restricted to the passive voice. You can use that anywhere. For example, ein Mann läuft die Straße entlang. A man walks along the street. Active voice. Great, no problem. Another way of saying that in German is es läuft ein Mann die Straße entlang. Okay. What does es mean in that sentence? It does not translate to English. That's an option that simply doesn't exist in English, but it means the same thing as a man walks along the street. Okay. We have to be... Oh, this is where my lookout point is. Is it? I think it is. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop here because there's an awesome lookout point where you can see the entire town. I'm just going to hop off the bike real quick and go take a gander. You know what? I'm going to leave the camera running because this won't take long. Okay. You know what? I might as well keep going while I'm at this. So, es läuft ein Mann die Straße entlang doesn't sound like it makes any sense in English. And in fact, you can't phrase it that way in English. But it means the same thing as a man walks along the street. Now, we have to be careful with the verb conjugation here because... wurde has to be conjugated to match the subject of the sentence, not the topic of the sentence. And this is a bit confusing. So, I mean, look at that view. Can you beat that view? That's an amazing view. That's the town of Canmore, ladies and gentlemen. I love it. And there's the Three Sisters. That's what they call that mountain there. Three Sisters. Faith, Hope, and Charity. They look down over the town. Isn't that amazing? I love this view. It's my favorite spot in Canmore. Okay, back on track. So we have to be careful with the verb conjugation. So, for example, let's say 3 men were arrested. 3 Männer wurden festgenommen. Okay, great. Another way to say that in German is es wurden 3 Männer festgenommen. But why is wurden conjugated in the plural? Shouldn't it be conjugated to match es? Shouldn't it be es wurde 3 Männer festgenommen? No, because es is not the subject of that sentence. Es is the topic of that sentence. Those are not the same thing. The subject of that sentence is 3 men. So wurden is conjugated in the plural to match 3 Männer. Okay, let's look at some examples that will hopefully help to make sense out of this. Active voice. Die Polizei hat den Täter gefasst. The police arrested the bad guy. If we want to switch that to passive voice, in English we might say the bad guy was arrested by the police. Same option exists in German. Der Täter wurde von der Polizei gefasst. And in both languages, by the police is optional. So you can just say in English, the bad guy was caught. In German, you can just say der Täter wurde gefasst. No problem. But there's that extra option in German of using the topic placeholder. You can say es wurde der Täter gefasst. Okay, that one doesn't exist in English, and it looks kind of weird. Shouldn't it be es wurde den Täter? We've got der Täter on the right side of that verb. Doesn't that mean it's the object of the sentence? No, it's the subject. Der Täter is the subject of that sentence. Es is the topic, or rather the topic placeholder. So es wurde der Täter, nominative, is correct, even though it looks kind of weird. Another example, active voice. In Italy, they eat a lot of pizza. In Italian, isst man viel Pizza. Okay, great. If we want to switch that to passive voice, in English we might say, in Italy, a lot of pizza gets eaten. Okay, same option exists in German. In Italian, wird viel Pizza gegessen. Okay, easy. But again, they've got that extra option in German of using the topic placeholder. Es wird in Italien viel Pizza gegessen. It means exactly the same thing as in Italian wird viel Pizza gegessen. It's just a different way of phrasing it, but it's an option that doesn't exist in English. So you start to think that, okay, well, at the beginning of this you said that English and German were roughly even in terms of complexity, but it sounds like German is way more complex than English. So what's going on here? But hang on, because there's some extra expressiveness in English that cannot be expressed in German. This is where we get our revenge. There are some sentences in English that simply cannot be translated directly into German because the German language doesn't have the ability to phrase it that way. So specifically, in English, we can take an indirect object and promote it to the nominative subject of a sentence. They cannot do this in German. Why? They just can't. It's not a facility that exists in German. So, for example, the children were not believed. In English, the children is the subject of that passive voice sentence. But in German, we've got a problem because the verb glauben, to believe, is a dative verb. So its object must be expressed in a dative case. And the German language has a rule that a dative object in a sentence cannot be promoted to become the nominative subject of a passive voice sentence. Why? It just can't. So you end up with a sentence that looks really strange. Den Kindern wurde nicht geglaubt. Okay, there's at least 2 problems with that sentence that I can see right away coming at this from the point of view of someone just learning German and just starting to figure it out. First of all, shouldn't it be die Kinder if it's the subject of the sentence? It isn't. It isn't the subject of the sentence. It's the dative object of that sentence. That sentence has no subject in German, which is strange. The second thing we notice is, shouldn't it be wurden? Den Kindern wurden nicht geglaubt. Shouldn't we conjugate wurden to match the subject? Well, again, the children is not the subject of that sentence. That sentence has no subject in German. And when a sentence has no subject in German, they default to third-person singular verb conjugations. So den Kindern wurde nicht geglaubt, believe it or not, is actually correct. That's how they express that in German. Now think about the other option that we have in German to express that using the topic placeholder. Es wurde den Kindern nicht geglaubt. Oh, okay. Wurde now is conjugated to match es, third person singular. So that starts to make a little bit more sense, maybe. At least it's not quite as crazy as the other example, den Kindern wurde nicht geglaubt. Now at least it looks like the verb conjugation is correct. Now, this leads to some small number of sentences that simply cannot be translated directly into German from English. For example, in English I can say, someone gave me a book. Okay, I can translate that to German, no problem. Jemand hat mir ein Buch gegeben. Literally, that's someone has given a book to me, or someone gave a book to me. That's a subtle distinction. The meaning is the same, it doesn't really matter. But it's an important distinction. The verb geben in German is, like glauben, it's a dative verb. Its object must be expressed in the dative case. And a dative object cannot be promoted to become the nominative subject of a passive voice sentence. So we've got a problem there. The problem is that in English I have an extra option that doesn't exist in German. I can say I was given a book. You cannot express that in German. Why? Because geben is a dative verb. So the closest you can get to that in German is to say mir wurde ein Buch gegeben. To me was given a book. Or es wurde mir ein Buch gegeben. You cannot say ich wurde ein Buch gegeben, even though that seems like it should work. That's a literal translation of how we would say that in English, but it doesn't work in German because they don't have that option. English is just a little bit more expressive here in that we don't care if we promote an indirect object to the subject of a passive voice sentence. It's fine in English. It does not work in German. So, on balance, the two languages end up being maybe kind of more or less equal in terms of complexity. That was a lot of information to absorb. Now, the funny part about that, and this is going off topic a little bit, but that's okay because nobody's watching anymore at this point, and I'll tell you how I know nobody's watching. At the beginning of this season, I took a look at my YouTube analytics from the previous season, and what I found was, because YouTube will tell you at what point people stop watching your videos, and what I found was, especially in the longer videos, the 20-25 minute videos, by the time you get to the 10 or 12 minute mark, not even halfway through the episode, 90%, 9 out of 10 people have stopped watching. They've clicked away because they're bored and they want to do something else. So at the start of this season, I said, okay, well, we're going to do much shorter videos this season. We're going to keep it short and to the point. No more 20-minute monster videos. The problem with that is that even if you zoom into one specific area like passive voice, it's just not possible to explain it in less than 20-25 minutes. It just can't be done. So these videos are going to end up being long no matter what I do. And I guess it means that 90% of the people are simply not watching anymore. If you are watching, if you're still watching this video, and you've been watching from the beginning, I salute you. You are a YouTube trooper. You are in the 10% of people who actually watch the entire video. And that's awesome. Unironically, you are the person for whom I am making these videos. That's great. All right, let's sum it up. English and German both have an active and a passive voice. English sort of has a third voice, or at least the remnants of one, mediopassive, sort of a middle voice. Doesn't exist as far as I know in German. And German has these weird impersonal passives and also the use of a topic placeholder that kind of throws you for a loop the first few times you see that. So on balance, I mean, yeah, there's some sentences in German that you can't directly express in English and vice versa. So the two languages are both complex in their handling of passive voice, but they're complex in different ways, which is kind of interesting and kind of fun to learn about. Now, if you have any feedback about this episode or any ideas or suggestions for future episodes, as always, either post them in the comments below or use the email feedback link on the bottom of the website. We've already had a small trickle of emails with ideas for future episodes. That's great. I love to see it. Please keep that coming. And I will make every reasonable effort to fulfill those requests in future episodes. That's all for now. We'll see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.